I'm going to ask our colleagues to sort of introduce themselves. Obviously, Dr. Floater, thank you very much for the report and for chatting. Brian, if you could tell a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure. Brian Dove, I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Skyscanner and been in the industry a bit.
Cool. Pablo?
Pablo Caspers. I'm the Chief Air Supply and Advertising Officer from eDreams ODJL. I'm not a technology expert.
Thane?
Hi, Thane Jackson, Vice President of BZD Travel, responsible for our global distribution strategy. And like Pablo, I am definitely not a technology expert.
Hi, Roger.
My name is Roger Van Enck. I work for a company called Finnair. We're a mid-sized carrier. We have around 70 airplanes. If you haven't heard about Finnair before, we have a sauna in the lounge that distincts us from others. That's unisex, if you were guessing what it was. And we're also the official airline of Santa Claus. So if you have very difficult questions for me, I have his phone number, so I'll make sure you don't get presents.
Brian, I'd like to start with you because your company has been in the news. As Skyscanner having been bought by Ctrip, it kind of dovetails with what was discussed in the report. Do you have any enlighten us about what might be happening with the company?
Yeah, it's been a busy couple of days. So actually, I think it's at this point still a proposed transaction, not closed. So there's actually not very much that I can share at this point. I do have a prepared statement though, if you'd like the official.
No, that's
PR
okay.
text. Okay.
Could you comment about one of the things that Dr. Floater mentioned was that there's this potential hybridization that may happen between OTAs and metasearch companies and some potential consolidation. As you look at the industry writ broadly, what are forces that would be driving that kind of change?
Yeah, I think it actually connects to a number of the other topics that were brought up as well when we think about gatekeepers and we think about consumer demands evolving. The notion of connecting with a particular search engine and connecting into another site or another app or things like this, as consumer experiences change, what does it mean to be part of that value chain when people are doing everything through voice, like something like Siri or Cortana, or they're engaging through chatbots, as we were talking before about Messenger and things like this. So I think the notion of how metasearch models and helping consumers really make informed choices as they evolve, they're going to evolve along with consumer models. So I don't know that it's directly tied to the OTA experience, and more so about meeting consumers where they are and meeting their demands as they do evolve and as we see these continue to develop both in the short term and the medium and long term.
Okay. When Dr. Floater was talking with Kevin just now, one thing that he surprised me a bit by was saying that he saw sort of metasearch in a way as a sort of roughly in competition or a conflict with the larger DDSs, which are also doing price comparison at a big level. What response do you have to that concept?
I think to be fair, they're complementary in a lot of ways. And so if you look at the metasearch model is really focused on connecting directly with consumers and providing them with a broad range of choice. If you look at the classical GDS model, it's much more on supplying to other business suppliers that are connecting to the consumers. And so I don't see them as much in conflict as one versus the other. It's really about the constituency that they're connecting with and transacting with.
Okay, cool. Pablo, eDreams ODJL had sort of been interviewed by Dr. Floater and his colleague for the report, but because of time deadlines, he wasn't able to have an official comment included in the report, but it informed it. Is there what struck you about the report when you read it? What did you felt sort of really resonated?
So I missed a little bit the consumer view. This report is very much about technology, about connecting airline content with the agents, so with the B2B part. I was also missing in this report that was mentioned by Dr. Floater, which is the possible partnerships in between airlines and their today so-called distributors, which might be us, for example, as an agent. We are behaving more like competitors when we see like Finnair.com, for example, and any OTAs, which shouldn't be the case. So it should be more a partnership, and everybody should focus and bring into the business where they are strong.
What are some ways to make that actionable? What are ways? Are there examples maybe outside of travel and other verticals where you see large companies sort of bringing in the fold smaller, technologically innovative companies, or are there any other examples that are sort of inspiring to you of how the airline industry could learn from?
So I think Amazon is always a good example. So Amazon is not relying its business on the products they sell themselves. So they have a multiple or huge part of their business are small connected retailers and distributors, but they act as a booking platform or as a transactional platform. They acquire traffic, they attract the consumers, etc. So I think this is something where we could learn a bit more regarding the collaborative potential.
Thane, when you read the report, what struck you?
I think what struck me most of all was the general theme that Dr. Floder referenced during his interview around collaboration across the value chain. I think as a TMC, a travel management company, looking at this marketplace, we see players in the marketplace, we see organisations, we see what you might call regulatory bodies in the organisation heading off down a particular path. And in some instances fairly far down that path already, but perhaps more collaboration, more bringing in of all the elements of that value chain would be a better result for all of us, because at the end of the day we are talking about the travel distribution industry and ultimately we're looking to service our customers. So if we work better together, ultimately our customers will want to work with us more and we'll all benefit from that.
Sure. Roger, what struck you in the report? What really resonated?
Well, I think it validated a lot of our internal thinking, so that was always nice to hear. There were some new things about the regulator and what effect they have, especially in Europe. I think most of us know in the room that there's 4 airlines in America that control the majority of the market. There's 20 in Europe that have a similar share. So it's a very different environment we're dealing in Europe. So I think that was a very interesting angle that I think we hadn't spent a lot of time on internally, but it's very important for us on how that will work. How the consolidation, going back to what Thane said about collaboration, I think what we'll also maybe see is consolidation of the travel chain. So we'll see, first signs is Ctrip acquiring Skyscanner, the mega OTA, but the other one is American Express buying a online booking tool. So I think we'll see more of that type of acquisitions come in the future.
Cool. Dr. Floder, to follow up on Roger's comment, one thing that may not have gotten touched on in your conversation with Kevin is in the report, it talks about how full-service carriers may be sort of pressured by technology to make some changes and given certain advantages or disadvantages. Could you sort of gloss what you feel like how large full-size carriers may see the future in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I mean, obviously, recent history has shown the impact of the low-cost carriers on the airline industry, and that to a large extent has driven many of the decisions that have been made and the direction of travel. I think what we're seeing now is, first of all, a reaction to that, which is a need for differentiation, or at least a perceived need for differentiation. History shows in any sector that if you try to differentiate, then often the competition will close down that gap. But nonetheless, that is obviously a big driver at the moment. And part of that process, of course, is direct distribution. And this drive for more direct distribution, more airline.coms, and greater sales through that. I think we're going to see that continue to grow in the short to medium term for the reasons that I've just mentioned. But I think as we go further into the future, what we're going to see is so much complexity, and particularly at a global scale where brands are not as strong as you go outside your home country as an airline. We're going to find perhaps a greater need for aggregation. Now, how that aggregation takes place and the sophistication of that aggregation is open to question. And I think it comes back down to how much collaboration there will be in the industry. But at the moment, we're seeing these 2 parallel tracks, and eventually they are probably going to need to be integrated in some way. If not, I think that consumer complexity and confusion is definitely going to grow, and I don't think that's in anybody's interest.
Okay, thank you. So Brian, Skyscanner has had some experiments with chat, and Facebook and such. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it actually relates back to the previous question as well. So when we see these evolutions of what the various priorities are, both for airlines and for OTAs, I think part of this is that the notion and the idea of a direct channel also starts to evolve as technologies evolve. And so a lot of the work that we do on, we have bots on Skype, on Facebook. We've done voice integrations with Amazon Alexa and some other instances. The things for us that we see evolving is we see consumers also discovering what they're looking for, and by working with us and giving us feedback, we can see what they're doing. We can see how products can evolve to what their needs are.
It wouldn't be a technology event if some technology didn't go wrong.
Let the nerd in the hoodie go.
So I think some people may have missed that. You said it was 3x?
Yeah, so just when we see user growth on our Messenger bot, we've seen it grow 3x in terms of recurring regular usage just over the last 4 or 5 months since we've launched it. And we're constantly refining it, constantly adding new functionality, and really, as consumers are exploring this as a medium, the question came up before if somebody's used it. And naturally, with any new medium or any new channel, both sides have to evolve, both the product creator as well as the consumer, and become more sophisticated and be more expressive about what they're looking for. Are people looking at the bot interactions as a way to drive inspiration and discovery, or are they looking for the booking experience? Is it a post-booking support experience? And across the industry, you see these experiments on all of these different notions. And so I do think when we look at the short, medium, and longer term, both around direct and intermediate aggregators, it's really about the notion that direct channels will continue to evolve as consumers choose to interact across different mediums than perhaps the traditional browser or these days browser plus app, and those will continue to evolve. And we keep working and pursuing those to understand where consumers want to be served and how they want to be served across all these various channels.
Okay. Skyscanner has had, Sir Roger.
Because that's a very interesting discussion that we're having internally. It's about what does the consumer really want. So Skyscanner has a bot. We're soon going to launch a bot of our own. We're working with Skyscanner, so we're launching the NDC API. Skyscanner is connecting to that, so it's really exciting for us to be able to do that. Currently, it's only focused on selling tickets, basically. Some, manage my booking type of behavior as well. But the biggest question I have that the community also needs to think about is, should airlines also allow customers from Skyscanner to check in through their bots? So where do we want to kind of lose the customer, or where does Skyscanner want to gain the customer? That's a very big question that I think has also been slightly addressed in the report as something that we don't know the answer to. Do you have any comment on that, Dr. Floater? Because that sort of dovetails into one of the things that you sort of in the report talk about, how these technological changes may advantage the intermediaries or large technology companies that have a sophistication to be able to invest in the R&D to do them. But some suppliers would like to drive direct bookings, and they may like to think that AI and chat would actually level the playing field for them, so to speak, and give them an advantage. What leads you to believe that the probabilities will go in the one direction?
I'm not necessarily suggesting it is going in one direction or the other, but I think one thing that is really important is to define what we mean by direct distribution. Yeah. Now, if a consumer goes directly to a website completely neutrally, without any other entity, any other company or organization guiding them in that direction, then you could probably call that direct distribution, a direct sale. Once you have a gatekeeper or a GDS or an OTA or whoever it is becoming an intermediary, then it no longer becomes direct distribution. And I think that there tends to be a discussion in many quarters around direct distribution through the intermediation of gatekeepers, as if that's not an intermediary, versus indirect distribution through GDSs or through OTAs and so on. Actually, what we're seeing is that simply there is a new intermediary on the block, and they do things in a different way. And I think for airlines, as I think Roger was alluding to, there is a major question, which is how far do airlines want to go in terms of the relationship with any of these industry players, in terms of allowing their direct distribution to go, their customers to go to somebody else. And again, we come back to power, negotiating power, and ultimately, will airlines be big enough to be able to negotiate with any of these other players who are intermediaries?
Just to build on that last point about where do they go and where the power is in that relationship, I think this is also gets back to the point around collaboration. And so when we look at multiple components of the value chain really focused on serving travelers and consumers, the more people can work together, share information, it's less about one particular part of the value chain owns the customer relationship and conceals other details, but you can have plenty of information sharing so that from a consumer perspective, they feel like they're interacting with a homogeneous experience regardless of the number of technology providers or hops that are engaged. And so Roger alluded to some of the booking work that we've done, and we've seen this with other partners as well, where the consumer is truly interacting with the airline, with the operator, but not necessarily in isolation.
Pablo, how do you see airline commercial strategy changing because of all the technology shifts that are discussed in the report?
So we had a prominent example in the past changing their distribution policy in Europe, and costs came up, what the external distribution cost and the internal distribution cost is. Listening to what everybody says and what is written in the study shows that the investment in technology, in engineers, which are not easy to attract, etc., will increase heavily, I guess so. So this balance of evaluating the current cost of self-distribution, to call it self-distribution, not direct sales, and with intermediates will clearly change. And I think an airline, for example, is extremely limited to its own content. So there will never be a one-stop shop for the big choice. They don't have comparison with others. Because then intermediates come in already, like metas, for example, or like OTAs, and I don't see the discussion as a global discussion. I think we have a global distribution which we have to face on, and then there is a local distribution, because the brand awareness is in the home market, but outside the home market, it's difficult with direct sales, and I think it will never work out. So there must be a collaboration.
Okay. Thane, no report is perfect, even one by someone esteemed as Dr. Floater, because it's such a small report and such a big topic. Facebook is currently working with Bain to produce a report. IATA recently produced a report. There's a lot of different versions and perspectives. What was something that you felt like maybe wasn't emphasized or could be better, or you thought got wrong?
I wouldn't say there was one thing that sprang out to me that wasn't emphasised. And I'll go back to my original comments about collaboration and maybe pick up on some of the theme that Pablo has been exploring there, is that we tend to talk about direct distribution or indirect distribution. And you might expect me as a TMC to raise this topic, but we tend to ignore maybe the people that are in the room, and the reason we're in the room is the GDSs. I've essentially commissioned this report, or Amadeus has commissioned this report. And we tend to talk about the future being something wildly different. And we tend to talk about the big players out there and how they will evolve, but we are maybe underestimating how the GDS companies and the owning organizations, the IT solution companies, will also evolve in there as well, because they play a massive part today. I mean, 90% of all content comes through GDSs, certainly for TMC world. It may be slightly different in the OTA world, but I would still say it's a very large proportion. And maybe what has not come out of that report for me is to what extent the distribution organizations will themselves evolve, because I don't imagine they're going to sit back and let their business just fizzle and disappear. And I think they will still retain a very large place in the industry in future. Yes, they have to evolve, but maybe there could have been more around that as how we think they will evolve and what they will provide as intermediaries in the future.
Roger, did you have any comments?
No, I really like, in my airline we have the same discussion like what Pablo mentioned before. There are some people in my airline who also think the same. They thought, the website will attract 80% of our visitors or our passengers at some point, but it's not the case. And I think if we can just do a quick hands up in the room, who goes to the website of their favorite airline and just books that price that is there? Is there anyone in the room that does that, or there's one or two? It's Finnair, right? No, so and I asked that question to quite a lot of audiences, and there's very few people. People like price comparison. People want to know that they got a good deal. Sometimes it's very difficult, though, to get a good deal, and that's why you see that the meta search engines have come up, because they compare prices between travel agencies, so it's interesting. But we need what I call the intermediary. We need someone in between. That's what the customer wants. That's what I want as a customer. Mm-hmm. And I'm not under the illusion that we will suddenly attract everyone to our channel. But we need to create a healthy travel ecosystem that works for everyone. At the moment, it works well, but I think it can be improved quite a lot. And I haven't been in the industry for a very long time. Most people I also lead a data science team, and most of the data scientists, very smart guys, they jump into the industry and they're very surprised by how things work. And of course, how things work has been invented many years ago, and they need to evolve. And I think we're at a tipping point now with the new technologies and some of the new business models that were done in Central Europe. And I think that will really change the world. But under no illusion, a very good example is my airline won't be able to fill our business class without a TMC. We need TMCs to be able to fill our business class. We need OTAs to fill a lot of our base load. So we need each other, and we need to collaborate or start buying each other in order to make that work.
I think, if I can mention this, that this discussion is also somehow provoked based on the evolution of the direct sales capabilities of the airlines, which on the agent part we did not follow, based on the fact that ancillaries and fare families and all this merchandising content was not aggregated. But again, the big players like BCD or eDreams or DJ are global players. So we cannot connect to each individual player. This is simply driving down the performance, the volume issues and speed issues, accuracy issues. So if this would catch up in the aggregation, and I think again GDS are extremely capable, and if they would connect smaller specialists and players, as I think at least in the example of Amadeus we see that they acquire startups and invest in startups, etc., then the direct sales capabilities in comparison to the trade capabilities will decrease clearly. Today, an airline has it's easier to sell ancillaries, etc., as for a big agency player, but this might disappear, this advantage, and then we are back to the situation where we were before.
So if I may just add to that to give you an example. So for my airline, when a customer books through our direct channel, 1 in 4 passengers buys an ancillary, flight-related ancillary product. When a customer goes through a travel agency, whether it's in TMC or an OTA, 1 in 100 buys it. That's a flight-related ancillary. So it's a huge gap. And we need to improve that. And we have a lot of projects internally to try to get the GDSs to sell better. And some GDSs are better at it than other. And of course, we need to improve that. My worry is my challenge also to you guys is just to be careful that the likes of Skyscanner and some of the other guys, they might not wait around, and they will produce, or they'll build this capability to do this before maybe the GDS does. And that's, I think, the big worry.
Yeah, and I think that's the same in the world of travel management as well, is that we have deep relationships with all GDSs, with deep relationship with airline partners, technology companies, and so on. We see a need for evolution, and we welcome that evolution, but we won't sit around either and wait for that just to happen, wait for someone else to do it for us, because if there's an opportunity there for us to serve our customers better, to provide them content from different sources, we'll look at that. That's not to say we're rushing down the road of building direct connects with every carrier in the world. We're not a GDS as a travel management company, and we're not in the business of doing that. We are not going to rush down that road at all. But where there's additional content, like ancillaries, which is really where the money is being made at the moment, and the US airlines in particular are minting money at the moment out of ancillaries. If our customers are requiring that, then we're looking at that. We're in conversations about that. We'll look at that in our mobile space. So we won't necessarily wait around for distribution to be provided to us if there's a customer need.
Are the TMCs feel like they're in a good place technologically to compete in a certain sense?
Are we in a good place? We're not traditionally technology companies. I think we're entering into that space. Our own particular strategy around that is where we have things that are key to our core business. So for example, our provision of information and traveller tracking, security tracking, risk management, where that's key to our business, we'll keep that internal. We'll manage that, we'll own that ourselves. Where we need to go into partnerships and collaborations with other organisations to provide things to us that perhaps are not our core. For example, when we're looking at big data, we've entered into a collaboration around that. So I think we're in a good place because we are not confined to just doing it ourselves and owning it all ourselves. We're prepared to collaborate and work with other channels and other organisations to achieve what the customer needs. Because at the end of the day, we're in business because we're a customer-driven organisation and we're there to provide service to our customers. We're also there to make money as well, and we shouldn't maybe ignore the dirty word of money around here. Because all of these changes in distribution are, in some respect, not reducing costs, and I'll pick up again on Pablo's comments around the published costs around direct distribution and indirect distribution. All that is happening, I think, in that world is we're shifting those costs, and ultimately the consumer pays the cost in one way, shape or form. It might be slightly lower in different channels, but we're in business to do that, and we will look at collaborations with other organisations to provide that technology where needed.
In the report, they talked about an example of a TMC potential collaboration, which was that airlines might come up with a risk score about the likelihood a flight might be canceled, I believe, and then that information could be passed through to a TMC, which could then maybe sell travel insurance to the end corporate traveler consumer. Mm-hmm. Is that a metaphor analogy? Does that ring plausible to you?
It does. I mean, I think it's in its infancy and really has taken place in the hotel world, really. And TripAdvisor, I think, probably is a very good example of doing that, of providing that kind of consumer-generated feedback, or maybe some level of risk around that, some level of information around that. I could see that happening in the longer term. I think that's a way away yet, where we are essentially saying, you know, fly this airline, or don't fly this airline, or fly this destination, don't fly this destination, because we are very driven by where our customers' businesses are going and need to go. We already provide risk information to our customers, often why we're feeding that directly to the customer, often direct to their security department, so they can make that assessment of risk anyway. So it's kind of there in parts, but it's maybe not to the extent that it could be in the future.
Okay. Brian, this might put you on the spot, but Skyscanner has done a lot of work in Asia with its customers and has a special Chinese directed website. Is there anything you guys have learned in how Asian consumers use technology that is relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few unique trends there. One is almost an obvious one, that it's so predominantly mobile. You have a number of different geographies there where a lot of the users have never owned a PC, didn't grow up on a PC. Their first real connectivity to the internet and to the world is on a device and has stayed there. And I think that in general almost foreshadows the shift that we continue to see in other parts of the world, where people do commonly have multiple devices, and so you see it called out in the report where it talks about the shift of being able to search on mobile and transition onto a desktop or onto a PC, things like this. So that's definitely one trend that we see come through. Another one that we see come through quite a lot is, especially in mainland China, but also around some of the other areas in Southeast Asia, the dependence upon voice as an input mechanism is really unique relative to some of the other cultures. And as best we understand, a lot of that is driven by the level of keystrokes required to do character entry in some of these languages, where you might have to type 20, 30, 40 times with your thumbs to express a simple word or a simple city, and people have started to opt more and more for voice, and so we see that adoption happening there. And as those models mature, we definitely see those broadcasting elsewhere. The other piece that was called out in the report is just the dramatic growth that we see across Southeast Asia, both China and the rest of APAC, and we definitely see that within our trends, within our numbers.
The report says that if the power of gatekeepers like Google increases, and if regulators allow them to remain outside of the obligations of display neutrality, and that the smaller full-service carriers will be substantially threatened by the larger airlines. What's your take on that, Roger?
Sorry, could you repeat the
Sure.
last part?
If the gatekeepers like the Googles and Facebooks of the world increase in their power of their consumer devotion, as it were, and if regulators allow them to remain outside of the obligations for display bias in the US and Europe, travel agencies and GDSs, as a general rule of thumb, have to disclose if they have commissions or fee structures and how they're displaying things. But right now, MetaSearch and some of the new gatekeepers are outside of those definitions. What is your thought? Do you believe that the smaller full-service carriers will be substantially threatened?
At the moment, we're not seeing that yet. It's an ongoing discussion we also have internally, and quite a strategic one we have with our executive board also about, and we monitor it quite closely. I'm not too worried about it. I think when that becomes a big problem, then the regulator will step in. So we're not seeing that. The Google and the Facebooks, so I think they will be very big, and I think they will really disrupt the travel industry to some extent. And the question is, do we want to be part of that, or are we going to fight that? And especially, so I'm not Finnish, so I might see Finnair from a slightly different perspective than the normal Finn, but Finnair it's a medium-sized carrier. We're growing 10% per year. It's high, but still we're medium-sized. And I think it's better to be part of that future than to fight against it.
Mm-hmm.
So we're actively working with those players also to engage with the customers.
Sure. Brian, the MetaSearch companies use an advertising model that relies on non-neutral comparisons, in the words of the report. What is your take on this sort of debate over definitions?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. One is that the concept of paid search or paid rankings and things like that is definitely not universal. For us personally, we've focused for quite a long time really being unbiased and really being driven by the actual price to the consumer that they can experience, and that's what they see on the sort. And so it's not as influenced by advertising in the sort, whereas there are definitely there are multiple models of how that advertising spend can influence that. I think in broader terms, though, when we look at advertisers' spend, there's multiple ways to express that. Some that are really positive and helpful for consumers, and some that are perhaps in some of the bad actors and misleading. But understanding when you're seeing something sorted exclusively by price, seeing an advertisement that tells you for X dollars more, you can fly another airline that already includes a free bag or a free seat selection or free changes or refunds or things like this. There are definitely advertising models that make sense in line and within the results, but it's really, really important to be crisp and clear to the consumers that they are making that fully informed choice, as opposed to where those advertising spends influence the sort of what they're seeing without being crisp and clear to the consumer.
Pablo, what's your take on the regulatory question about gatekeepers? What do you have any predictions in the next 5 to 10 years if their power continues to grow?
So it was interesting to hear that you said if a mid-sized carrier would somehow feel to be threatened, then first of all, Facebook and co, they can't fly and operate aircraft, so there is always a part of the business from stakeholders which is covered. Meanwhile, the regulators have a view on the cost and that there is no abuse, let's say, then it's a question then of where the sale is going to be done, in which kind of channel. Is it direct, is it intermediate, etc. So I think we also again have to separate on what the core business of an airline normally is, which is not ticket distribution. The core business of an airline is operating aircrafts. And I think there's also lots of things to do, and technology is also very important there to facilitate the user experience or the customer travel experience, which I think from door-to-door experience, let's say, at least the piece of the travel, there are lots of things to optimize, which is not very ideal today.
Mm-hmm.
It is an interesting discussion around the gatekeepers staying outside of that level of regulation and non-biasing, because if we look at the report statistics, broadly speaking, I think it was 75% of the travel is leisure related and 25% is business travel related. The business travel community is subject to very strict regulations about non-biasing and information around that, whereas the bigger part of it, which is the consumer, which is where the consumer revolution is kind of happening, is subject to no regulation. So I think ultimately the regulators will start to look at this, and will start to look at it particularly when airlines start to lobby for that, when they suddenly feel they're losing their power in that negotiation. If these gatekeepers do get as big and start to really control the direction of travel, so to speak, I think airlines will have to respond to that, and regulators will have to get involved in that, because it'll be very, very one-sided in that environment. But if I could predict 10 years from now, I wouldn't be sitting here, I'd be lottery winning and at home. So.
Well, even so, I'll try to get you to predict one more time. For your space in TMCs, there's about, say, 5 global TMC players right now. Do you feel like technology is going to encourage more consolidation? Dr. Floater was saying with Kevin, that's a natural tendency of business.
I don't know whether technology per se will drive that consolidation. I think the costs of keeping up with technology might. I think competitive pressures might. So that's maybe a very short answer to that. I think there will be consolidation, but it may not be driven solely by technology.
Okay. In line with gatekeepers, I mean, it's possible for, Airbnb is interested in started reaching out to business travelers. Expedia has its Agencia business, and it's now incorporating HomeAways, alternative lodging. The CEO wants to double down on that. Do you feel like there are non-traditional players that are getting into the TMC space, and how the industry is going to react?
Absolutely. I mean, Airbnb is a particular example of that. They are starting to try and enter into that space, but we are seeing reaction to that already with hotel groups kind of reinventing themselves to almost become part of the sharing economy. I think ultimately, and I'll use Airbnb as an example, as an excellent example. I think people will start to look at this. It may not be the natural choice for business travellers today. It may be more of a natural choice for business travellers tomorrow. But ultimately, I think it will be cyclical in that as they start to take some share of that traditional business travel space, so the bigger players of the world, the bigger hotel chains of the world will start to respond to that. And ergo, regulation will start to come in. There'll be more pressure for those sharing economy players to have to abide by the same kind of regulations as the bigger players do. I think lobbying will come into that as well. So I think they will encroach into the traditional space. I think it's a welcome encroachment. Some competition is always worth having. But I think it will start to manifest itself as a more traditional product in the longer term.
Brian, one thing that was brought up in the report is that there is a possible pathway, which is that the rise of the consumer revolution and how people have changed their expectations. Technology is changing their expectations. How they do retail is changing expectations. And travel, according to the report, the travel industry has been underestimating the change and has been somewhat slow to adapt to it and recognize that collaboration might be one way to move forward. What is your sort of take on that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of notions here. One, I think anybody trying to predict what consumers will fancy or prefer from a platform, from a tool, from a technology, X years into the future is effectively impossible, right? The rate of change and the rate of invention and the rate of introduction of new ideas and new concepts that continue to take the technology world by storm, if you look over the last couple of years, going from 9 years ago in the iPhone to things like WhatsApp to things like Snapchat, Instagram. You see these massive platforms that reach hundreds of millions of consumers around the world come out of almost nowhere in a very short period of time. And one of the things that the report did call out was the notion of organizations needing to adapt to those consumer trends and really embrace the idea of experimentation. And I think one of the pieces that was perhaps undersold is that the concept of experimentation is not purely a technology concept or something down this path of being able to test things, but it's really an organizational philosophy. And it's about a willingness to embrace change and to try things. Some will work, most will fail. When you look at a lot of the technology incumbents like these gatekeepers, like a Google, a Facebook, a LinkedIn, companies that are well known for doing experimentation within their own vertical, in their own space, they see 2/3, 3/4, 80, 90% of the things that they try don't work out. And I think that just as a mentality and a philosophy of organizations is quite counter to the way most businesses have run for quite a long time. And I think that notion of a philosophical transition for an organization to embrace consumer trends, to embrace experimentation is going to be, it will naturally be challenging. It goes against everything most people have learned for the majority of their career.
Dr. Floater, one of the things I was struck by in the report is that it's travel. I think a lot of travel industry players who've been in the industry for a while, they feel like there isn't a good analogy or metaphor in other verticals. They often get compared with retail. The CMO from Ryanair, made the case that travel could learn a lot from retail because it puts the consumer focus. But the product is so complex. There's so many, frenemies, where you're competing in one area and you're cooperating in another. It's a very complicated product. Is there an analogy or a metaphor that you've sort of had in your head of some other industry that's done well, where large companies have sort of brought in innovation from smaller players in order to help change and adapt to the new technological trends, or something that people could look to as kind of a guide or a metaphor?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, certainly true, of course, the travel distribution industry is complex, and it's more complex than a lot of standard retail, and that's why the likes of Amazon and others perhaps have been more reluctant or found it more challenging to enter the space. It's not anything to do with the product per se that's being sold. It's more about what goes behind that product. And we talked about security, we talked about risk, we talked about the role of TMCs in that. That's something that you don't need to worry about when you're buying a pair of sneakers. Yeah? And that is one of the fundamental reasons why GDSs exist, why TMCs exist. That they are providing a value over and beyond simply aggregating. Yeah? We talked about the aggregation aspects of meta-search companies, and of course, if you need to provide the customer with the credibility that what you are providing them with is truthful, and if it's based on cost, which has driven this industry for so long, over the last decade or more, if it's based on cost, it's relatively transparent. When you start to have more complexity, the differentiation that airlines want to have in terms of providing different types of products, different services, packaging them all together, then it's much more difficult to make those comparisons. And that's where, for instance, display neutrality becomes much more of an issue, because it's much more difficult for the consumer to make that choice. Mm-hmm. So, just drawing on a number of the elements that have been talked about previously, one of the things that came out of this report was the number one factor that survey respondents came up with in terms of driving change is security. This year, over the past 18 months, we have seen more terrorist attacks on airports and in general in Europe than we've seen before. There is a heightened level of security risk, or perception of security risk, and that came through the survey. And we often don't talk about that element of it when we talk about the gatekeepers, for instance, and simply aggregating information. But it's very, very important. And there are other aspects, of course. What are the tax regimes in different countries, whether you put tax on a bag, whether you put tax on a ticket, whatever. It makes it complex, even today, when it seems to be relatively simple. Imagine how much more complex it's going to be when there's going to be the potential to use big data to understand what individual consumers want to do. Not only will we be able to segment customers in a much more sophisticated way between different types of people, almost down to the individual. Already, technology companies are looking at segmenting the individual. You are not the same person on a weekend when you're reading the newspaper and you've got some time on your hands as when you are in an office meeting. Yeah. And one of the really big areas, I think, for innovation will be micro moments. This is the idea that you target a customer based on a few moments when you're at the bus stop or you're in an audience and it's getting a little bit dull and you're having a look on your smartphone, or you're waiting for your friend for a coffee, that is the moment that you might be in the right mood to buy. Yeah? We're going to see so much more sophistication coming through than we can imagine today. However, for all of this, as we've mentioned, there is a question about how resistant the travel distribution industry will be because of its complexity. And that's why, of course, it hasn't changed that much compared to retail over the decades. I think it will change. I think it will change rapidly. I think it's up to the industry as to how much they resist or how much they don't. But coming back to a point that someone else mentioned earlier, that we do bring out in the report, and it's almost a recommendation, is that when it comes to global distribution systems, they're not simply an actor that is left out of this. They need to evolve as well. They will need to innovate. They will need to probably, we suggest, open up their platforms, bring in innovation from outside, get third parties in, collaborate, with the likes of, meta search companies and others. Because if they don't, just like any other player in the industry, they will fall behind.
Yes, Roger.
Just to answer also from my perspective and challenge a bit the other panelists. So an industry that I really admire is, or let's say a company that I really admire is Booking.com. So I use it a lot. It's great to book hotels. So when I go with my wife on a romantic weekend, I can filter. I can say I want breakfast. Let's say we go to Paris. I want a 4-star hotel for the weekend, close to the Louvre, and I want breakfast and free Wi-Fi. Now I need to market my airline a bit. So we are a Skytrax 4-star carrier airline. We're one of the safest airlines in the world. We have a great product. We have new planes, young fleet. Yet when I'm searching for flights through any of these channels, I cannot filter by quality, Wi-Fi, etc. So as an airline, I'm reluctant to invest in some of these customer experience type of products or enhancements because the customer never sees it. So I would like to challenge my fellow panelists to develop those kind of features, because that's one way how we can make the industry better, I think, for the consumer.
I think from a TMC perspective, I can answer that one reasonably well, and we have our own, in BCD Travel, our own trip source program. The trip source is an app, it's a .com, it works across multiple platforms, it brings itinerary management, it brings hotel booking capability, it will eventually bring air capability in there as well, and it also has a tremendous potential to bring the capability to differentiate ancillaries and those kind of things directly to the consumer at the point that they need it on their mobile device. So we're already on that path from our perspective. So there's my sales pitch.
Good.
So I agree. You're right. We have to separate or classify also on the airline. But this was done, I don't know how many years ago, on the hotel side already with a star ranking, for example. Yeah. All the hotels are known by the 5-star rankings. Right. Even now 7 stars since Dubai is invented this. Even the stars are used in countries where there's no official testing, no confirmation about the quality. They just put the stars on it, or others just use similar symbols. We don't have this on the airline. So it could happen that somebody comes out of a low-cost carrier and is happy that everything went well and gives a 5-star ranking, for example. And then the free of charge Coca-Cola of a full-service carrier was without ice cubes because the machine was broken. And then the experience is rated a 2-star experience. So we need really to find a way to globally qualify the difference of the carriers, for example. And it cannot be done by the agents. It must somehow be, again, the collaboration. And once these standards might be defined, then it must be aggregated. And there are like Route Happy and all these kind of players trying to aggregate these convenience factors. And I'm also with you that a price can be cheaper, although it costs more, because the service is convenient for the user. But we are currently limited, actually airlines do exactly the same, on price ranking. So if you look on your own website, the cheapest price is on top, and then it goes with the next prices. And there we have to find a better solution for everybody and for the consumer to somehow have better filter capabilities and and find the best price or best value for money.
Because yeah, go ahead.
So I was going to say, I think the notion of best price versus best value is quite an important trade-off.
Yeah.
And I know for us, one of the things that we've been challenged with is looking at all this information and how do you distill it down into a way that a user can comprehend it and make an informed choice without feeling that they're totally overwhelmed and almost feeling like they're stuck in chaos. Speaking of star ratings, we launched star ratings for the particular vendor of a ticket when you're looking at purchasing a ticket, say on a Finnair or something like this, and being able to contrast. And we very actively see consumers making purchasing trade-offs where I may be willing to spend more to get something from a 4-star or 5-star vendor versus a 2-star or 3-star vendor. And as you would assume, the same way that consumers have been trained through things like Amazon, through things like hotel reviews. And I think that's right. It continues to simplify what consumers have to make trade-offs between. And I think the challenge for all of us is to figure out how do we do that in a way that makes sense for a consumer and is honest and is consistent.
You asked about analogies in different industries, and you know, I think we're all agreed that travel distribution is a slightly different animal. But just to give some examples, the Amazon Marketplace was given as an example. You know, Amazon don't just sell their own goods; they've opened up to small retailers, and they have benefited enormously from that. They've shared value. If you think of apps and the ability for pretty much anybody to invent an app and have it out there, and if it's successful, it can go all the way around the world. That's shared value. Whether it's allowing operating systems that are open to software that can be used rather than being closed, that is shared value. So I think you can see a lot of examples out there in other sectors of collaboration that is about bringing different talent together, innovating, and sharing that value. And I think that is the core of what is going to have to happen and what will happen in the travel distribution industry. The question, I think, is not, is that going to happen? It's, when is that going to happen, and how much resistance is there going to be before it happens?
One thing we've talked about is the gatekeepers. It sounds like they're kind of this monolithic group, and they're going to keep growing and growing. But I asked about 7 different people at Google to see if they might be able to attend the panel, and because of conflicts they weren't able to. But I think from their perspective, if I would try, is that they would say they face competitors too. Among the gatekeepers, they have the rise of possibly Amazon with Alexa and voice search. They have Facebook, they have WeChat, they face a bunch of competitors. And that has a knock-on effect for suppliers because now you have to interact with multiple. You have to be making connections and trying to be understanding and savvy about these different platforms. How, Roger, when you think in terms of a goal of segmentation on the way towards personalization, how do you sort of make judgments about what bets to make technologically in the next couple of years?
So I somehow also think that the world is becoming simpler. So there's a lot of consolidation happening, especially on the travel agency side. Mm-hmm. So we still deal with close to 100,000 IATA agencies, but I think it's going to consolidate much more. It's going to be a lot simpler. So I don't think it's that complicated to build solutions and personalize for all these different gatekeepers or whatever you might say. But going back to something earlier that you said, so between the airline, the supplier, and the customer, there are now more and more middlemen coming in between. So you have credit card companies take a chunk, you have the agent, you have the meta search agent, et cetera, et cetera. But there isn't much more money an airline has to pay for all this, or the customer. So I'm really wondering what's going to happen is who is going to go bust? Is it going to be the airline because we can't afford all this in between, or is it going to be one of the panelists or someone in the audience? I don't know. But we are building, I guess, holistic solutions. We would like to build win-win strategic partnerships with our travel agency communities, our meta search providers, etc. We invest in our GDS capabilities to allow the travel agencies to sell our ancillaries in a better to boost that 1 in 100 to 1 in 10. We're investing in NDC to make sure that Skyscanner and the likes are connected to it. What's happening in Asia, what Brian said was we fly to 6 destinations. We see China, it's the future. They're leapfrogging a lot of different technologies that we have. and we need APIs like NDC to power those. And we're investing quite a lot in our direct facilities. So this week we launched or announced that we were going to hire over 70 new developers that are going to be coding our website, building new apps for us, etc. So we're building our own kind of ecosystem. But that will be more focused on Finland and Estonia and our region, and that's how that. So we have this. We're doing everything. That's basically what I'm trying to say.
That makes sense. Thane, about automations and machine learning, how do you think that's going to affect, TMCs? Do you see it's just a customer chat issue? Do you think that they'll actually be making the agents super powerful? And
Yeah, that's $1 million question, actually. I think for us, it's probably too early to really predict, other than to say it's going to have an impact. I can see that it will enhance what we do. If I look at the way over the last 5 to 10 years, and I'll use the example of online booking engines, online booking tools, how they have kind of grown in presence in the corporate marketplace. What they have essentially done is automated a lot of the simple stuff that agents used to do. So we are now able to process more with less people. I think machine learning, artificial intelligence, chatbots, whatever, are coming into play and will maybe continue that journey, maybe in a slightly different way. But I'm by no means an expert in that particular area, and if I could predict that, again, could probably make my millions.
Well, I thank all of our panelists for a very lively discussion. We're wondering whether my colleague Kevin was fielding the seat. Everyone was invited to ask questions when they came in.
Okay, so does anybody have a question they'd like to put their hand up? I've got a few more for the panel, but stick your hand up in a second if you have one. Graham referenced Amazon at least twice. I just wondered...
How about Kevin? Why don't you get a seat?
So Graham referenced Amazon at least twice. So I just wondered the rest of the panel. Amazon last year made a big thing about how it was going to get into travel, and it tried a few things, and then rather unceremoniously, 6 months later, decided that it wasn't going to be in travel. I just wondered, first of all, why you think that was the case. Did they look at it and think, throw their hands up in horror and say, this is just too crazy, we're stepping out? Let's start with you on the end, our representative from Finnair. Why do you think they decided not to?
I don't know. It could be because a lot of airlines don't have an API that Amazon can connect with, and I think that will change in the future. It's a complicated business, especially the payment and the settlement that comes later. So I think that could be one of the reasons they moved away. I don't know. You need to ask them. It's just guessing.
Who else wants to guess why Amazon pulled out?
I think it's too complex. So the airline industry, it's not about you have a piece that you put a price on and then you just sell it and send it to the consumer. It is you have 180 seats or 86 seats on a 320, and then these seats don't have all the same prices. Actually today, which was a former booking class assigned with one price, has now 4 different fare families possibly and 2 different cabin classes. So I think it is just simply too complex, or much more complex than retailers' classical business is, and therefore they stepped out again, I guess.
Yeah, from Skyscanner, probably a huge sigh of relief when they decided not to. Although you are a partner of Amazon with your Alexa.
Yeah, we're a strong partner there. So I think it was less about that. Somebody else previously mentioned that competition is always good, as it provides consumers with more choice. I think what's notable about it is less about guessing why they exited. I think as Roger mentioned, we should probably ask them. But I think Amazon's very vocal about the fact that they do run quite large experiments, and as they get bigger, their failures will be much more noticeable over time.
Okay, we have an audience question. Roberto from Dolphin Dynamics.
Hi. How about the hotel industry, for example? Don't you see a huge opportunity of disruption and change in the hotel industry? I mean, some of you sell hotel products as well. What do you think about that?
I'll take that one. I think there is a huge opportunity there, but the challenge with the hotel industry is it's already so fragmented that it's difficult to see how one single piece of it in the distribution chain will make a significant difference. You have some very large players out there now who are perhaps doing some of the gatekeeping as such, which may not be to the pleasure of the hoteliers who are paying a high price for that. But it's so fragmented at the moment that I think there's an opportunity for it to come together and maybe have a more aligned distribution strategy of its own, that may be an opportunity for it. And there's an opportunity for it to consolidate and to collaborate more closely with other players in the industry, again, so we're all collectively better off, rather than perhaps focusing solely on its own single brand, if that makes sense to you.
What's your point of view, Roberto?
My point of view is that there actually are more intermediaries in the hotel industry, and different ways of distributing is much more fragmented. Possibly because it is more fragmented, there might be more opportunities to change the way it's distributed. If somebody comes up with some more innovative business models, the airline industry, in a sense, because of its nature, has been around for a long time. I think there are probably less opportunities to disrupt in a considerable way.
Yeah, and I think there's also much more money for, let's say the hotel commissions are
Absolutely.
a factor 10
Yeah.
higher
Yeah.
than the airline commissions. So there's a lot more opportunity, and there's a lot more both financially and kind of disruptive in the hotel business than there is in the airline industry. But airline industry has something, still this romantic thing about its, people like the airline industry and flying, and it's wonderful, and I think that's why it gets a lot of attention.
Yeah, but with the GDS, especially the airline industry is already quite streamlined.
Yeah.
I think the hotel industry, for a number of reasons, because of fragmentation, is not as streamlined. So maybe there are opportunities. I don't know.
I think it's also not so easy for you in the hotel industry, because an airline flies from A to B or from A to C via B, so you have two markets, the origin and the destination as source markets to fill the plane. You as a hotel, you have your hotel is in one destination, you have the whole world as a market. So how will you reach the market if you don't do this via big partners? So the reach, the need for reach, or to reach your customers, is much more complex than for an airline flying from A to B.
Absolutely, which is why the direct distribution is not really, it's less of an option for hoteliers.
Yeah.
And
Which is very good for
Yeah.
us.
So we'll start at the end with the airline. If you could request Amadeus to go away after this and do one thing for your business, what do you think it would be?
It's attribute shopping. So it's this booking.com experience. So it's enabled these guys here next to me to be able to show that Finnair is a 4-star carrier. So enable them to show that we have Wi-Fi on board, etc. I think we might, once they do that, we'll enter a new era of bundling again. That you'll see more airlines become full service, because it's no longer the cheapest price that kind of wins and where everyone is unbundling. So that's my hope for the future, and my hope with Johnny. Johnny, did you hear? Good.
Okay. Your message to Amadeus, please.
To continue to evolve is probably the simplest way to put that. I think the technology that Amadeus provide and provide to us in certain parts of the world is tremendously good, but it needs to evolve. It needs to be able to provide more content, more aggregated content, and display things in a more effective way. I'm not saying that they should necessarily rush down the road of NDC as such, but some of the concepts that NDC are bringing out there, and the ability to display better, richer content from multiple sources, is an extremely good concept. So to continue to evolve, but play a leading part in that evolution, because they're a fundamental part of our distribution chain, and I think they should continue to do that.
Okay, congratulations, the first mention of NDC this afternoon as well. Well done.
I've got many more acronyms I can throw out.
Yeah. So what would eDreams like Amadeus to go away and do later on this evening for them?
So evolution is pretty much what we also would like. We need 3, and I would add a 4th one, pillars regarding distribution or content sourcing, which is speed, accuracy, volume, and possibly also stability. And this is clearly something where online business is based on. It's not about having the customer waiting a second longer or 2 seconds longer, because this means losing the customer. So we need the technology components, but we also need the content, and the GDSs must work on the evolution to make it easier for us as big agents to connect and sell, and to have this 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 or whatever the outcome could be on merchandising.
Yep, and I think we talked quite a lot about being open, and there's a lot in the reports about opening up in these shared value offerings, whether it's in App Store or OSs, and I think the notion of Amadeus being able to make that data available much more openly to other startups, to other innovations, and seeing people really embrace that consumer ecosystem and experiment with things and do so in a cost-effective way.
Okay. And Graham, presumably you would like Amadeus to commission you to do another report. But what would you like them to do? What do you expect them to do? What do you think they should do?
Given the amount of time and effort and hair tearing that this produced, I'm not sure I would want them to commission another one. But I think I'd like to see them innovate. I'd like to see them experiment. And above all, I'd like to see them open up to a greater range of partnerships that goes across the industry, not as we've seen from all industry players historically, these bilateral contractual relationships that I think are going to be a thing of the past.
Okay, so those of you that were too shy to put your hands up and ask a question, the panel presumably is hanging around for a little while afterwards if you want to ask them further questions. The only thing between you and some cocktails next door is my colleague Jean Quinn, who would like to say a few words.
I'm Gene Quinn. I'm co-founder of Tnooz. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to our excellent panel and Amadeus for pulling all this together, and especially the London School of Economics for the thought-provoking report. I have a public service announcement before we get to the bar, which is the ultimate public service announcement. Several questions have come through on Facebook. I want to let those folks who are participating through the live stream and all of you, invite all of you, if you have questions, there are easy ways to get a hold of our friends at Amadeus and at Tnooz. We'd be more than happy to direct those questions to our panelists and see if we can't get you a speedy answer back. So thank you for all of that and for all the pent-up questions. We at Tnooz don't sell travel and we don't sell technology, thank God. That's why all of you are here, and we're happy to, as Kevin said, be thoughtfully provocative and promote the debate around the selling of travel and the selling of technology to support travel. All that remains now is to continue that conversation into the future that Dr. Floater has predicted, and excuse all of ourselves to the bar and have a safe ride home. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Again, an applause for you and our panel.